The State Library. I'm Paul Duldig, Chief Executive of the State Library Victoria, and I acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country, and we support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. So I'm truly delighted to be here to celebrate the launch of the latest book in the Writers on Writers series, On Peter Carey by Sarah Krasnostein. This is the 12th book in the series, which is a collaboration between the fabulous publisher Black Ink, the fabulous University of Melbourne, and the State Library Victoria. And it's an especially appropriate instalment for us to be launching here at the library as it focuses on Peter Carey's True History of the Kelly Gang. Who's read True History of the Kelly Gang? Yeah. Can you remember what that...
Sarah, you've read...
Yes, Sarah? I hope you have.
Parts.
Yeah. I remember the thrill of reading that, and just that sense of Ned Kelly almost leaping off the page. That voice, that language was just incredible. And as Sarah points out, we have Ned Kelly's armour and his Jerilderie letter here on display at the library. Perhaps you're also aware that Sir Redmond Barry, the founder and first chair of the library back in the 1850s, was also the judge who sentenced Ned Kelly to death. And another connection, as well as founding the library, Sir Redmond was founder and first Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. So lots of layers, as they said in Shrek. And those of you who have read the Peter Carey novel may remember the framing narrative. It's conceived as a first-hand account written by Ned Kelly, an extension of his famous Jerilderie letter, housed in various archive boxes in the Melbourne Public Library, now known as State Library Victoria. And today the State Library holds a vast collection of Peter Carey's papers, correspondence and electronic records, many housed in very similar archive boxes. And if you've had a chance to have a look over here, you would have seen that. And this includes all the drafts, notes and papers related to True History of the Kelly Gang, as well as Carey's correspondence with publishers and editors about the manuscript. Sarah explored the Peter Carey collection as part of her research and describes a visit to the library in her essay. And it's easy to imagine the fictional collator of Ned Kelly's narrative sitting in one of our fabulous reading rooms to sift through those boxes, much like Sarah did when writing a book about the novel. And you could almost imagine Peter Carey sitting in our reading room to research and write his novel, but he wrote True History after moving to the US. He has been quoted, though, on his childhood memories of the State Library, remembering the Ned Kelly armour and the cool oasis of the reading room on a scorching Melbourne day. And in fact, he cited the Ned Kelly armour and Redmond Barry and that connection as one of the reasons he saw the library as a safe home for his manuscripts. But before things get too self-referential, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the University of Melbourne. After a long history of informally partnering with the university on different activities, this year saw us begin a formal 3-year partnership with the university through the Faculty of the Arts, and thanks to Sarah and Russell for the fabulous work they've done from the university. And we're looking forward to working more closely with the faculty on research and programming in the coming years. And after this conversation, we'll hear from the Reverend Professor Russell Goulburn, Dean of the Faculty of Arts. I'm now delighted to introduce our guests for this evening. Sarah Krasnostein is the multi-award winning author of The Trauma Cleaner, The Believer, and the quarterly essay, Not Waving, Drowning. She's a regular contributor to the Saturday paper and the monthly, and was awarded the 2022 Pascal Prize for Arts Criticism. And she also holds a doctorate in criminal law. Sarah is in conversation tonight with Professor Tony Birch, the Boisbouvier Chair in Australian Literature at the University of Melbourne. Tony is the author of 3 novels, 5 short fiction collections, and 2 poetry books. His most recent book, Dark as Last Night, was awarded the Christina Stead Literary Prize and the Steele Rudd Literary Award in 2022, and was also shortlisted for the 2022 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Fiction. Please join me in welcoming Sarah and Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm here to have a wonderful conversation with Sarah. In the digital age, I have this new device. It's called an index card, but it's also on a spiral, so it's technologically advanced. So that's going to be my aid for this evening. I'd suggest you get one at Officeworks. They don't cost much. We're here to talk about Sarah and a remarkable essay on Peter Carey, where there's so much material that I could talk about and want to talk about. I do want to reiterate the acknowledgement of country here tonight, that it's such a privilege to be talking with Sarah on Wurundjeri land. It's always a privilege to talk on Wurundjeri land and to accept that invitation to talk with great respect and to talk with great generosity with our guests. It's important just to note that when I finish, before we hear from Russell, we'll certainly have time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience, so you might want to start to think about this. The other thing, of course, is that Sarah's book on Peter Carey is, as has just been alluded to, the 12th book in a series, which has been a wonderful series. It's been series edited by Chris Feig, and I'm very lucky to be writing the next book on the dual Miles Franklin winner, Kim Scott. Again, as has always been already been alluded to, this is part of a wonderful collaboration between the State Library and the University of Melbourne. And as my role of the Boisbouvier Chair, I get to be part of that partnership. So I feel very fortunate to be able to do that as well, and to talk to Paul endlessly about running, as we do each time we catch up. But now to Sarah. Thank you so much for your book, Sarah. Sarah reminded me out the back that she attended a workshop that I was involved in 24 years ago almost, and I reminded her that the proceeds of that night, me and Christos Chalkos took to the casino and made more money out of. So we both got something out of the workshop. I think, as Paul's alluded to, it's so fitting to be hosting you in this room and in this building tonight. You remind us toward the end of the book that the library opened in 1856 and it was available to anyone to join the library as long as they were over the age of 14 and they could display clean hands. So can everyone just make sure you have clean hands tonight? My serious point here is that there's a real reverence for this place. I remember I came here a lot as a teenager, as a kid, because it was free. The museum was free, the library was free. And I would walk around here in really sort of hushed tones, but it felt like being in a church of knowledge, a church of intellect. So my first question is about doing the research here, and what sense did you have of not only the history of the documents, but of being in this building, being in this place? How did that impact on the research, or how you felt about it?
It's a real writer's question. Not easily answered. Thank you, Tony. Gosh, I think there's a quite, depending on how you sit with the feeling, it is kind of a reverence, because you do feel kind of the weight of all of the stories that are in the building and all of the stories that were happening around the building. And so maybe as writers, we're always kind of aware of this anyway, but you look at, or I would look at the vicinity of where this building sits, and I'd know that, Kelly's corpse was dissected next door when it was the Melbourne Uni training hospital, or the first court was across the street. And so it's kind of a reverence for the stories that I guess comes from our engagement with the books and all the stories we know, but as a writer, kind of that activating pressure of all the stories we don't know and all the stories that there'll never be time to read, and everything that you're not kind of finding as you chase the various rabbits down the various holes, trying to research as much as possible and still meet a deadline. So it's kind of that ambivalent feeling when you're in a space like this that holds just so much that you want to know.
The other thing that you talk a lot about, you talk about the Giroudley letter, and you talk about also the Sidney Nolan paintings, the Kelly paintings, which are based, of course, on the armour. Now, this isn't entirely hypothetical, but it's one that really continues to grab my attention. So the letter is so important to Carey, to find voice, to find that first-person voice. And we know that the armour was so central to Nolan's paintings, but also there's a weirdness about thinking about that armour coming out of the mist as it did in the movie, let alone real life. But I wonder, if we did not have the letter, or if we did not have the armour, to what extent do you think that the Kelly story would still hold? Would he just be another bushranger?
Oh, it's such a good question. Because everything kind of that I had read, and I tried to read as completely as possible with the Kelly scholarship, does come back to this kind of very ineffable sense about the armor and the imagery of it, and this kind of disembodied knight, and all of the kind of archetypal significance of what an image like that activates in people at the time, and how that's passed down. And then we have the physical history and an object. So I think it is strongly tied to this happenedness of a physical surviving historical object. But I think a lot of it also comes down to questions of personality that he had that the other kind of bushrangers didn't have. And I got a kick out of, listening to a lot of these old, and they are, a lot of them, old blokes, is the technical term, talk about their, dissertations on Kelly and talk about their books on Kelly, because it's so strongly partisan. And, they had kind of, around this personality or around the boyhood fascination with the objects, built these very heavily defended narratives that couldn't possibly be the entire story, because they were either black or white, and he was either, a cop killer or he was a hero. And I was so interested in that. So yeah, I think it does come down to this mixture of uniqueness in the personality and the objects he left.
Yeah, and I suppose I certainly don't want to dismiss that, because I think your comment, or the word uniqueness, is vital, because Kelly, he makes this history happen.
Yeah.
So that the fact that he pens this 9,000 word letter, that's a long letter.
Yeah.
And it's so eloquent. It's so damning of the crown.
Yeah.
And then the whole notion of the armour, it's not as if, it's just by luck that we happen to remember because he did these two things. They were profound things that he did.
That's right.
Yeah. The other thing I was really intrigued about, the way you discussed geography here and time. So that, again, I don't think it's not a coincidence, it's not an anecdote. So in one of the things that Sarah writes in the book, and it's about the way that I sense through this about history can be so expansive, both geographically and over time, but in a way there's this intimacy. So one of the things that Sarah reminds us of is that Peter Carey is born in 1943 in Bacchus Marsh, which is in the near west. Around that same time, Sidney Nolan, who's a member of the CMF, the Citizens Military Force, gets posted to Nil, which is in the far west, and that one of Kelly's brothers, Jim, is still alive and living in regional Victoria. And you talk about this triangulation of these three historical figures and geography. So I was really intrigued by that, because again, it's not coincidence, it's just not a fact. It's the way that this history over vast time you're able to compress into this intimate time and space. What were you thinking when you wrote that?
So that's just the easy bit for me, because I really struggle in my work, which demands that I kind of landscape out to broader conclusions, but initially and persistently I only really see the details. So that was kind of getting where I started from, where are these people, these men? What is their relation to each other, and how can I get as physically close to it as possible to even begin to start to say what might be new to say about this? And I think kind of that location of them in time and space in their uniqueness or their individuality, but also their relation to each other. I was trying to imagine myself into Carey's shoes or his kind of cultural context coming up at the time that he did, and how he might have understood or, metabolized Ned Kelly. But also, if I'm going to say anything of value about the place or the time where he fits into the collective consciousness or the history, you only arrive there by looking at the specific details of personal, relational interactions. So that was me trying to, start at the beginning.
Well, I think that was really effective because you talk about collective consciousness. That in my notes here, I talk about here that now thinking not just about the connection between these figures, but us as both observers of this history and reading your essay, reading the Carey book. I talked about a collective investment and responsibility. So in learning that from you, that, Jim is still alive. He's so connected to Ned Kelly, and he was protected by his family because I suppose people saw him as a curiosity and someone they would come and probe for questions, it sounds like. That, in fact, it also made me think about history is not, it's here. Like I felt that it was right here with me while I was reading the essay.
Well, I think that's kind of one of the most political things we can do, isn't it? That to remind people that these are not abstract concepts. This starts at the level of personal understanding and interactive ethics and morality. These are real events and real people, and the more we abstract them out into causes or symbols, the more dangerous it becomes. So I think that's kind of more symptomatic of history more broadly, or the most successful histories that we have. They kind of abstract out and it becomes kind of so meaningless because of that detachment from its original context. And so sometimes the most radical thing we can do is restore all the details. And it's going to be shitty, that's also the technical term, because if you're doing it right, there's a lot of conflicting things. The narrative isn't as neat as you'd like it to be or as you need it to be for narrative purposes. But I think that's where kind of the gold is.
I want to ask you in a moment about your field trip to Bacchus Marsh, but I want to talk about the book itself for a moment. So, in the introduction to the book, it's clear that the true history of the Kelly Gang eventually had an emotional and intellectual impact on you. But you do talk about the fact that for 2 decades, there must have been after you'd done my workshop, for 2 decades, the true history of the Kelly Gang sat on your IKEA bookshelf, which was not in good nick itself, apparently.
No.
And you hadn't read it. And then eventually, after 20 years, you picked up the book and you say, after reading it, I couldn't stop talking about it. So what I'd like to know, of course, what did you have to say about it? What was it that you couldn't stop talking about?
So I had obviously had this perceptual shorthand for who I thought Peter Carey was and what I thought his books were and what Ned Kelly was and how interesting that all was or how valuable it all was. And I quote a letter from David Williamson in the file saying that when he read the draft, it had cracked open the Kelly story for him in a totally new way, because it had kind of, in tracing the interior or inward experience of Ned Kelly, it had cracked open like the essential unfairness of settler society in a new way for him. And obviously I am in a totally different position to him, but it did a similar thing for me at the same time as doing, and this is a writerly thing, I apologize in advance, but technically it was so exciting to see what he was doing at the sentence level that I felt inspired in my own work again. I felt you could think beyond normal ways of structuring or plotting, even to that detail at the sentence level. So it was all of these things in terms of reframing history, reframing the possibilities of the prose itself, and I was surprised by my own kind of real love for that book.
I mean, it does that, rereading parts of it over the last couple of weeks, it's one of those books where voice starts to carry you,
Yeah.
so that there is an awkwardness when you begin the book, the way that he constructs sentences with Kelly's voice. But again, once you get the rhythm of that, the voice is with you, and it's almost like you're doing an audio book.
Yes. Yeah.
You're hearing that voice, which I think is the great quality of the book.
Oh, I mean, I think that powerful eye, and it's not, like you said, it's a gamble, because either you like it or you don't. Either you can't get enough of that voice, or it's so off-putting that you can possibly turn the page. And sitting here and looking at that final edit that Gary Fisketjon did, the difference, and again, we only have the drafts that were shared with the library, so I don't know how complete that record is, but I do know that there are quite a fair few drafts, and I could see the progress of the story. But that last edit, just with the lightest touch, kind of removed the remaining punctuation. Yeah. And it was incredibly moving. Again, very nerdy, writerly position to be weeping over the elegance of an edit. But what he had managed to do with just very few marks on the page was beautiful, in that kind of relationship he must have had with Carey. I find that, very, very moving as well.
It's funny you talk about editors. Chris Fike has been editing my book on Kim Scott, and he sent me an email saying my comments are in yellow. So all I do is skim through to see how much yellow is there, and they haven't seen much yellow for 5 pages, and then there's all this yellow, and I move on. I don't want to go back. Yeah. So the other thing I talked about, what it is you couldn't stop talking about. So now you get in the car and you drive to Bacchus Marsh. Had you been to Bacchus Marsh previously?
No, I had not.
Did you drive past the Big Apple going to Bacchus Marsh? There's a giant apple outside town.
I did not have the pleasure of the Big Apple in
So
my recollection.
The thing you say about driving to Bacchus Marsh, and I am going to talk in a moment about one of his seminal stories, American Dreams, which is relevant here. But you say you went looking for something that I wasn't confident could be seen. So again, my other question is that what were you looking for, and what did you see?
So I was looking for what the town would have been in the 40s when that was all he knew. Mm-hmm. And I kind of am heartened by certain things being the same. So the light's the same to a certain extent. The streets were the same. The school, for the most part, is the same. You can see his parents' garage. You can see the first house. And then, you kind of have to visually, optically clear away a whole range of pizza shops and chicken shops and chips and, a whole range of clutter that wouldn't have been there. But it was, if you look hard enough and you walk around, you can definitely get a sense of the scale. So that's what I knew I was looking for. But part of the process is you kind of just have to put yourself there and hope that something happens or not, which, I guess...
And did it happen?
Yes, I think so. I believe it did.
So I was intrigued when I read that section because you're an immigrant from the States. And my favourite Peter Carey story is American Dreams, which I studied at Melbourne University, I think, first year, 1988. So I don't want to go into the detail of the story, but for those who haven't read it, it's set in Bacchus Marsh, and it's a story where the locals get incorporated into this incredible plaster of Paris model, and they become, in a sense, petrified, literally stuck in time in this model as entertainment. So in other words, they're literally unable to move forward. And initially when people see versions of themselves, they're quite amused to see someone pouring petrol at the petrol station, but then they realise the next day they're still doing that. So they never get to move on. And so there's that almost like that small town horror of modernism passing you by. So it feels in a way, that story, it's at times quite claustrophobic, and it can be a frightening image to consider that you can never move on. I was interested then that you talked about Peter Carey himself saying that when he first arrived in London, he felt joyously at home. So there's no shame of saying it. He felt at home. He loved it there. And I just wonder if you had that feeling that is he someone that needed to get away? And you talk about that second migration, of course, to the States, but that literally, had he stayed in small town Australia, he wouldn't have got away, and certainly, well, he wouldn't be a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I reckon so. It's again that kind of imagining myself into the shoes of a young man in the mid-70s who had kind of been told one thing about who his judges would be and who needed to be impressed and how, and what it meant to be, you know, an adult young man in Australia at that time, versus, you know, feeling he had this calling, wanted to write, belonging to literature more broadly, although very strongly kind of English tradition. And so what level of autonomy, creative and personal, does such a person have? Going away is always good for a whole range of things. Where do you go and why? I think that's a function of how he came up and what was valued and who he had admired. That kind of convict stain and those pressures and the rebellions that he had lived through in the 60s and the 70s. So all that coalesce, all of that is a long way of very messily saying, yes, I think he had to go away, which I think is interesting because he's the same age as Helen Garner, who never left. So who, you know, what does radical refusal of social expectations look like in a creative practice or an intellectual practice? What pressures were gender-based? What pressures were, you know, and then they come from a similar kind of country context as well. So it's interesting what comes down to personality, what comes down to other factors, but that's a long way of saying, yes, I think he had to go away in order to do what he did.
So the other thing that I think you linked that to very well, and I think this is where your own experience comes in quite strongly, was the notion of home more generally that you talk about in the essay. So I want to stick with that for a moment. So him leaving home, and you say that you're fascinated by the type of homes that Carey builds into his fiction, and they're homes which there's often absence. You talk about the presence of the orphan, yep. The presence of being abandoned as a child, yep. And that, you know, he takes you sometimes into homes, into rooms that are so comforting and so warm. That what do you think he's doing with the notion of home here? Particularly, again, that there's something possibly counterintuitive of someone who actually leaves.
Yeah, in order to find home. Well, you know, it's a question of belonging and what that looks like and what its opposites look like and what they feel like. And so through this kind of vast body of work, we do have these, you know, iterations of numerous orphans, numerous kind of people in positions of exile, and then these beautiful, almost like gorgeous representations of warmth and home being a place of physical comfort and also kind of emotional comfort as well, where one can have some breathing space. So, you know, I guess that goes back to small town Victoria in the 40s or 50s, his experience at Geelong Grammar, what the experience of going to boarding school at the best of times looks like, and what it looks like at a place, you know, that where, as we know from the Royal Commission, the caretakers did not fulfill their obligations. So and then more broadly, the question of Australia as our home, and what they were told coming up. You know, he says, I think I quote in there that, you know, he certainly had no sense that they were responsible or part of the line that was responsible for stealing the land. So this kind of sense that home, even in your home, wasn't what you were told it was, and how he's grappling with that. So maybe he does only see that at a remove once he gets to London, but I think all of that is already operating in the decision to leave in the first place.
Well, I know certainly, I think you do quote him here, as you do quote him. His public comments later, particularly talking about the theft of Aboriginal land, yes. Talking about the murder of Aboriginal people, because the other issue that I was interested in thinking about where he started life is that, from my work as a historian, the western part of Victoria is probably the most ferocious in the sense of the violence against Aboriginal people, which so many people living in those small towns would not be aware of, although others, of course, were aware of it. There's a wonderful comment here, so I want to turn to you and your migration, so that, and I'll quote from Sarah here, and you're talking about the disruption when we leave home, the disruption of losing home, and you write, this hemorrhaging of people and place, as you refer to it, has impacted on your own life. I'm quoting me now. Having moved to Australia in 1994, you write, and this is such a telling sentence, with moves of that magnitude, words are the next to go. That's such a big statement. So thinking of you as a writer, thinking of you as a reader, when you talk about that hemorrhaging, what happened? What is the loss there? And when you say words are the next to go, where do they go?
Well, if you can't communicate with a common vernacular or a set of cultural references, you feel instantly isolated, powerless, invisible, all the rest. I think all of the other factors which go into making a certain kind of writer, it may present very differently, but I think those feelings are kind of quite common across, well, at least most of the writers I know. And I can see it in him, in Carey, because he's had all of these displacing experiences. And busily writing, a huge novel every 3 years. So what does that mean? What are you writing towards? This kind of drive to tell, to be heard, to be seen, to explain. And, I say at a different point, writing yourself into a place that belongs, writing yourself into a place of belonging. So I think if you lose that, and you can lose it in many ways, you don't need to change continents, you can lose it in infinite situations growing up. And unfortunately, I think that experience might be integral to becoming a certain kind of writer.
And I think that because, if we took it literally, words are the next to go, we could be really mistaken, because if that statement came from a person, say a non-English speaking person, you think, okay, it's literally a breakdown in language. But I think what you're alluding to is, in fact, not being able to read the country, not being able to read the culture, which is another way of creating an absence or an inability. So I suppose the point there, when you again talk about the passion of reading the Kelly book, is it a book then that opens up the country to you, opens up the way that he uses language is the way that you learn about Australia?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, it's kind of an outsider writer, and again, that doesn't intuitively make sense when you think about Peter Carey, who was very successful, white male, at the time that he was writing. But, I write in the book kind of that internalized shame of the convict stain in relation to the big centers of literature. That doesn't go away with prizes or sales or time. And so you have kind of a writer who feels himself to be an outsider writing about a historical context. So it's not just Ned Kelly as an outsider. It's about all of the conditions which created this violent spasm of his final stand, which is ignored in all this scholarship that just makes it about Ned Kelly being a sociopath or not. It's, what are the conditions that created the need to have the Kelly gang in the first place? So those are levels of kind of outsiders writing their way into history. And I think, that's kind of was part of the attraction.
Okay, I want to quote you again, because if someone wrote this about a book of mine, that'd be it. The highest accolade. I could retire, or I could, find a way to get it on a headstone. Okay, so you write a tattoo, something like that. My highest praise, you write, remembering that a Carey novel is waiting by my chair or by my bedside always gladdens me and has been of comfort. I have never felt lonely while reading them. Now, I mean, that's a wonderful praise, but I've never felt lonely by reading them. So it's as if the reading or or Carey, he also secures you emotionally, because that, again, that notion of loneliness is that you lose that, or you're able to forego that when you're reading a Carey novel. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Because it's a really interesting comment.
Well, I think you could feel lonely reading in two ways. I'm just thinking it. The first is like a book that just does not grab you, or that you feel alienated from, or uninterested in, or otherwise kind of locked out of. So there's those types of books that are just kind of very cold reading. And then there's other books where you can't forget your troubles because the story just isn't gripping enough. I guess they're just two ways of saying the same thing. But because his stories they really are rollicking yarns, so you're carried along, or I was anyway, on this current of story and these intricately plotted narratives, and the kind of complex human whole represented by all of these competing first-person perspectives. And it's just all absorbing. A typical Carey novel is absorbing in the way that a good TV show is. But it also is emotionally absorbing because, I don't know, I get a sense of the effort that he's put into it, the presence that he's put into it, the filter through which the story was running in the years of its writing. And again, those themes which are close to my own work and in my own life, shame and its defenses, belonging and its opposites, looking uncomfortably at our histories and our, present, even though it might make us feel uncomfortable. All of those themes I feel invited into in the way he deals with them in the work. So yes, I think all of that goes into it.
I'm interested because you focus centrally on the Kelly book. So I want to ask a broader question about your reading of Carey. And I suppose an analogy for me would be that I did say that, American Dreams is not only one of my favourite Peter Carey stories, it's one of my all-time favourite stories. And that after I read that story, I just wanted to chase up all of his short fiction, which he'd done early on. So other stories like The Fat Man in History, like Crabs, are just... Yeah, Crabs. I love Crabs, the fact that someone can go to a drive-in and come out as a tow truck is... you think, well, how does that work? It works perfectly in that story. So they are just great. They are all-time favourite stories of mine. So I just wanted to ask, so with the Kelly book sitting there on the bookshelf for so long, I want to ask, firstly, had you read other Carey books before that? If so, what were they? Because I wonder if you'd read the Carey book before that, why did the Kelly book sit there? But also, what did you then do in the sense of catching up with his other work?
Yeah, no, so the Kelly was the first one I read, and that was, like I said, to Michael Williams. We were at home, it was 2020, and we were making use of what we had on the shelf. There was no going into the bookshops. And that was just revelatory for me. But I hadn't kind of acted on it before Michael Williams again asked me to interview Carey for Sydney Writers Festival. I think that was 2021. So then I went back to the beginning. Fat Man, War Crimes, Bliss, and then because, again, like this, you can tell that I was a lawyer in another life. I needed to go chronologically and tick off in exact chronological order because that was some mystical understanding that couldn't be engineered in the opposite direction. But again, books were not arriving in the post as they should have, and I couldn't go into any bookshops for a while because I just had a baby. So I had Oscar and Lucinda was the next one, Jack Maggs, and then Amnesia, No Place Like Home. Then it got a little loose, but I've now read most of them, although sadly for myself, not in perfect chronological order. Yes.
Okay, so I've got a couple more questions, but again, those who have questions will be able to take 2 or 3 questions at about 7:20. By the way, I'm a stickler for time, so we won't be here late. The union won't allow it. So, 2 questions. I mean, the first one, which intrigues me after what you've just said, is that, of course, by going back and reading Carey chronologically, other than the individual novels themselves, is there something you see as change in his craft, development, or commonality thematically? What ideas about Carey's work did you pick up by reading the novels in that way?
So character became fuller, rounder, more complex. I read in the book particularly women. That was where it was most noticeable. But across the board, the people kind of came into view until you could like almost hear them breathing. He became less concerned with, and again, I think it's an early career thing, or younger writer thing, appearing to be clever or seriousness, and just giving into humor, taking kind of the wildness of those early short stories, applying it in different ways so that it does have this kind of crazy energy at some point, but it's always at the service of plot. Plotting became so razor sharp and intricate and more complex. And so, there is that growth over time. I think he's learning from each book. His themes are changing slightly, but not really. We just have these different, increasingly elegant, increasingly deep iterations of his main concerns.
I mean, I really like that because, I mean, reading the short stories, occasionally some of those stories are impenetrable. I don't know what's going on. Those floating horses in the swimming pool.
The dolls, the white dolls.
And when I was an undergraduate at Melbourne University, those stories were privileged as the ultimate postmodern stories, the ones that you couldn't understand. But I think that blame the academics, not Peter Carey. I think that the fact now that you're saying him not being so concerned and sort of is ultimately, and I think he is a great storyteller in the end, isn't he?
Yeah.
And to understand that being a great storyteller should be something that we really value, and he's probably one of the best that we've produced.
Yeah, I mean, I think something happened along the way where plot is devalued as kind of obvious or commercial or whatever, but we need story. We love story. Yeah. It's hard to plot something in a compelling, surprising, realistically surprising way. And, I think Dickens is a good comparator for Carey because, again, similarly trendy to poo-poo that, but like good luck to anyone to try to replicate it. It's hard. So he's doing very complex things, and he's making it look effortless and feel effortless in the reading, which at the end of the day is the hardest thing on earth. It's easy to write something seriously and heavy and make it seem and feel heavy for the reader, but to make all the work that went into it invisible, like that's a lifetime's work.
And that's why readers love those stories, because you love reading. Yeah. Again, thinking, I remember when I taught creative writing, I'd have occasionally, not unsurprisingly, a young male student who'd write a story, and I'd say, I don't know what's going on here. And they'd say, I don't want the reader to know. They're still unpublished, but anyway. So just one more question before we go to the floor. How do you sit on the idea, being an immigrant from the States, but of course at home here in Australia, the whole idea that Ned Kelly is Australia's founding father in contrast or comparison to Thomas Jefferson in the US. So where do you come down on that point? I mean, Jefferson has very serious problems as well.
Of course. Yeah, I think he's a great founding father to have because, when, again, Michael Williams suggested that if he was around today, he'd be an anti-vaxxer, and that did knock some of the shine off of my impression, because I think he is absolutely right on that. But the attraction and the esteem in which he is held, and he appears on hoodies and bumper stickers and whiskey bottles and beer cans, and he's rolled out in any newspaper, and he still occupies this very visible place, and he activates these very strong emotions. And for a country that is as uncomfortable with the reality of its history as Australia is, to have a figure that compromised, occupying the collective kind of imagination, is a reminder of those conditions that created all of the violence that we don't speak about. It asks why we have reverence for somebody that, literally, told everyone in positions of power to get fucked. We love that. Why is that? I mean, it's traditionally said because we love an underdog, blah, blah, blah. But underneath that, what is that righteous rage and our admiration for someone who expressed righteous rage against unjust authority? That's a little reminder of all the work we have left to do. And we're comfortable doing it in fiction. We're comfortable having these stories just be yarns. We're not comfortable with it at the level of nonfiction. And so as long as that kind of difficulty remains, I think we're going to have, a soft spot for Ned Kelly.
Well, my boss is here. If I tell him to get stuffed afterwards, I'll blame you. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes where we can take questions. We'd love to hear some questions from the floor. If you can keep your questions direct, Anna Schwartz has put her hand up. She's ready to go. Here comes the microphone, Anna. You can go on as long as you like.
Thanks very much. Well, the first thing I'll say is sort of not pertinent, but it's actually to you, Tony. I had a visit today from my 19-year-old grandson who had told, when I told him that I was coming here tonight and that you were speaking, told me about your engagement with his tutorial at Melbourne University and how kind of inspirational and cathartic that was. So thank you very much.
Can you tape? Someone tape? Thank you very much.
But I'm just interested in the role and the intersection of the visual in the saga and in the apprehension and the emotional engagement with Kelly, the Kelly myth. Initially, the armour and the way that's remembered, perceived, and treasured and exhibited and held up as a very important, treasure. And then the Nolan paintings and how important they seem to be to the myth and what is their contribution. What are they really? And are they really about Kelly? And what else are they about? And to what degree is the visual a synthesis with the literature?
So there were so many beautiful comments that Nolan made elliptically in interviews that he gave, where he was referencing the paintings, saying that, if people really knew about this, they'd know that it was not really about Ned Kelly at all. And he saw in his representation symbols of his own life, his father's struggles, and ultimately the strangeness of being anything at all as a white Irish descendant in this landscape that he was trying to bridge the distance with his paintings. So I found that interesting. I also found it interesting that both times that Carey tried to write this book, first as a very young man, and then 20 years later when he finally found a way in, it was after seeing the Nolan paintings. So the first time was at George's gallery, and he was so blown away by that, he went off and he typed out the Jerilderie letter and carried it around, which is weird, only if you don't know any writers. And then the second time was at the Met in 1994, and I got the catalog for a very good price on eBay. And it had kind of a beautiful essay in there, I think it was Andrew Sayer, about the way in which vision works visually, or narrative works visually, being, we don't, and again, it used a quote from Nolan, that you don't, in any art, you're not giving a continuous narrative. You're using white space. You're relying on the reader to make or the viewer to make their own connections. And so thinking why that second viewing at the Met kind of was the impetus for Carey to go off and actually get the thing done. Perhaps, and I'm just thinking like craft-wise in my own life, seeing Nolan tell a story in stages across the visual work gave him a way in of, okay, I don't have to do the complete life history in the way that I had conceived it. I can do a narrative in flashes. And I think the device of using the letters in the archives gives a similar effect of allowing us to knit together the kind of interstitial matter of a lifetime. So those kind of connections between the visual and the written are quite strong in the book.
It's interesting how the parcels and archives, they work like frames in the way that series of paintings work.
Frames,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Someone else, please?
Hi, Ian Blair, on agriculture, but can you comment on how you're so on the ball with current situations where, in the yes and no vote, but with the Aboriginal and understanding of land, and there's one side, and Ned Kelly paralleled this, and you brought that out so well in your book. Can you comment that your timing's perfect?
That's very lovely. I should just let that stand, because anything I say will just muddy the perception. I have no way of answering that. I just chose the topic, and I think these are perpetually relevant issues, unfortunately, in the culture that we've created and the politics that we continue to support with our votes or our purchasing powers. And so unfortunately, this was always going to be relevant. I don't think strategically in that way, sadly, but I kind of, and I write in the book, like writers write the book they are called to write, they have to write, because if it was for kind of strategic reasons or mercenary reasons, I don't think you would get an artistic product that any reader would want to stick with. So
I reckon you might be selling yourself short, just in the sense to pick up on the point. I agree, it's not sort of being overtly strategic, but I reckon that sometimes when we decide what we're going to write, there's stuff in the air, so that notion that you're starting to, your narrative is to respond to something that's happening or soon to happen, I think you would be aware of that even if it's not self-conscious in the writing.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. So I guess like where spidey senses are out all the time, because it's particularly when you do factual writing, you're paying a lot. I think you do factual writing because you are alive or interested in the surrounding culture in a certain way anyway, and you always were. So I do kind of have that interest. But if I were to give you an account of my daily reading practices, it would appear crazy. So yeah, it's a whole mix of things that are current and not current, and relevant and not relevant, and it all goes into the mix.
We'll take one more if there is one to close. Down the back there. And wait for the microphone.
It's just a question about the true history of the Kelly gang, and it's probably pretty basic, but the question is, why do you think he wrote it?
Yeah, so I mean, and I think this comes back to the other two questions quite nicely. I kind of considered him, Carey, at the Met, looking at these paintings in 1994, and, we know that he was a very successful ad man for a number of years, and was he looking at this activated American audience and thinking, yes, no, this is a wonderful thing that will sell, I must write this book? Maybe, but again, we write the books that we're emotionally called to write, and I don't think that we'd have the product that this book turned out to be in literary terms if that was just the sole motivation. I think that Carey saw in Kelly's outsider status, or his treatment by kind of the dominant, educated, intellectual classes of Australia at that time, something that didn't sit well with him. I think he saw an unfairness there in terms of who was held responsible for that violence and who had clean hands that, again, didn't sit well with him. And so he's churning this impulse to write about it inside. He's carrying that material or that feeling for a good 20 years before it comes out, which is very normal as well for writers. So maybe he had finally found a way in. He'd finally reached a point in his career that he knew how to do it. But I think he was seeing in all those levels, and probably above all his own interests, something that was worth exploring through that story.
Thank you. So I just want a couple of closing things, and I'm going to hand over to Russell Goldberg. Firstly, thank you everyone for coming along tonight. You've been lucky enough to hear from the writer herself. Everyone told me you were. I didn't know we'd met 20 years ago, and I was such an underwhelming presence in your life. But I was told, oh, Sarah's so lovely, she's so lovely, but she's also incredibly smart and generous with it. So before I hand over to Russell, I want to thank you personally. Just a bit of housekeeping so that when we're finished tonight, Sarah will be available to have a chat and to sign books for you to purchase. There is something that I didn't get time to ask Sarah about, and I think it's something when you pick up the book that you should look at, is that the things that I learned about this book is to be reminded what a great writer Carey is, how important he is in the national consciousness in regard to literature and how important that is. There's a little story in the book. So Sarah's just alluded to the fact that Peter Carey wrote the Jerilderie letter out by hand, so almost 9,000 words, and then he used to wear it under his shirt. One of the things that Sarah does, and this is one of those great attributes of writers, to find this beautiful line. A couple of pages prior to that, Sarah tells a story that when Ned Kelly was a young boy, he was awarded a green sash for bravery, for saving the life of another boy, a child who was drowning. And when Kelly died, when Kelly came out to confront the police with his suit of armour on, he had his child sash under him against his body, and that juxtaposition of the green sash and Carey's version of the letter, when I read that, I think, here's a writer really on their game.
Oh,
so
that's
that was
very
fantastic.
kind.
So
well, I learned it from Tony.
You'll find many of those. I gave that in the workshop.
That was a morning.
Yeah. So I got this idea. So I want to thank Sarah, but I now want to hand over to Russell to close the night out for us.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Russell Goldburn, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. It's a great pleasure for me to say a few words of thanks and to be representing the university as part of this collaboration with State Library Victoria and Black Ink. I want to thank, of course, Sarah and Tony. It's been such a privilege for us, I think, to be able to listen in on and be part of this conversation this evening. You've given us, I think, such a deep and generous insight into the creative process, both Carey's and your own, Sarah's, and not least within that the role of place, this place, as well as that theme of displacement as well. You've given us a sense of what it means to write, both in those broad senses of storytelling and plotting, but also taking us down to levels of artistry, the creation and curation of individual sentences, the creation of voice. One of the things that I was really struck by, Sarah, was your emphasis on empathy, imagining yourself into the shoes of others, imagining yourself into the shoes of Peter Carey and others who've gone before. And that theme of the ethics of writing has run through, I think, the conversation that we've heard this evening. There's a deep sense in this book and in the conversation tonight of getting behind myths. Myths, of course, have enduring fascination, and they're there to be queried and troubled and questioned. And a reigniting in your book, Sarah, and this evening, a reigniting of the pursuit of truth. It might be an old-fashioned notion, but it's one that you bring alive, I think. And towards the end of your book, you say that truth is the friend of originality. And in turn, you go on, the friend of new forms of human connection. It's been an extraordinary privilege for me, for us, I dare say, to have this connection with you this evening in conversation with Tony. I want to thank audience members for your presence here, for making that human connection and for being part of the conversation. I want to thank State Library Victoria and Paul for your generosity, for your welcome. As Paul said, there is the Peter Carey, the holdings of the library and the display, the exhibition that colleagues have put together. I want to thank Kevin Malloy and the State Library's collections team for making that available to us this evening. The Writers on Writers series is one of which the university is very proud, that collaboration with Black Ink and State Library. Tony has already said, of course, that copies of the latest Writers on Writers, copies are available for purchase, and Sarah, you very kindly agreed to sign some books. Copies of other books by Sarah are also available for purchase. So do feel free to make that human connection as well in a moment. I want to announce very briefly how this series is going to continue into next year. Tony's already mentioned that he very happily indeed is the author of the next volume in the series of Writers on Writers. So Tony is on Kim Scott, and that will be out in April next year, pending the responses to the comments in yellow, of course. And then we will have, in October next year, Tara June Winch on Alexis Wright. And I look forward to both of those volumes very much indeed. The conversation doesn't stop here. As I say, there is the books to purchase and to have signed. There's the exhibition to look at. Please stay, have a drink, enjoy this human connection that you have enabled through this book, through the conversation this evening. All that remains for me to say is to invite you now to thank again Sarah and Tony for a fantastic evening.